a ruthless, racist cop drunk on pride and prejudice, thrived on power and intimidation. His badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a weapon he wielded to instill fear, to control those beneath him. Every encounter was a chance to feed his sadistic appetite, a moment to prove his superiority. One evening, as the setting sun bathed the street in a gentle amber hue, he spotted Mike Tyson strolling down the sidewalk, alone. To the officer, Tyson wasn't a man. He was a target, an opportunity to assert dominance. The desire to show his power surged through him, blinding him to the reality that this was no ordinary man he was about to confront. The officer quickly stopped Tyson, accusing him of theft and loitering with an exaggerated sense of self-importance. Tyson, unfazed, stood still, his expression calm and composed. The kind of calm that rattled the officer to his core. Frustration and anger twisted within the officer. How dare Tyson remain unflinching, unaffected? Without warning, the officer's hand shot to his holster, and in a flash, he pulled his gun. The metallic coldness of the weapon gleamed in the fading light, aimed squarely at Tyson's chest. But Tyson, his reflexes honed by years in the ring, was quicker. In an instant, his hand shot out, faster than the officer could blink, disarming him with a clean, practiced motion. What followed was a brutal flurry of punches, each one landing with the precision of a trained fighter, a storm of fury that overwhelmed the officer. He crumbled beneath Tyson's strength, a broken man, his arrogance and his badge powerless in the face of true justice. Too late, the officer realized. His badge couldn't protect him from the consequences of his own actions. Like, share, and subscribe to see how this battle unfolds. See how the story unfolds. The fading sun cast a warm, gentle glow over Mike Tyson's broad shoulders as he ambled down the peaceful suburban street. The quiet of the evening surrounded him, a stark contrast to the storm that was about to break. He walked with ease, the weight of his past no longer burdening him, but reflected in the graceful power that still rippled beneath his skin. His simple black t-shirt and dark denim jeans clung to his form, revealing muscles that, despite the years since his professional boxing days, still carried the strength of a seasoned fighter. Even after all these years, Tyson's body maintained a lethal grace, every movement a testament to the raw power he had once unleashed in the ring. He was no longer just a champion in the boxing world. He was a man who had learned to control the violence inside him, to harness it. But in this moment, there was no need for it. The warm summer breeze swept over him, a perfect, calming contrast to the intensity of his recent workout. His mind was still reeling from the physical exertion, the adrenaline still lingering in his veins. He welcomed the peace, the quiet, and the solitude of the suburban evening, unaware of the chaos that would soon intrude on his world. His footsteps were soft against the pavement, the kind of walk one takes when no one's around, when the world feels like it's your own. The scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers filled the air, and for a moment, Tyson let his mind drift, lost in the stillness. But that peace was fleeting. As he drew closer to the next corner, the atmosphere shifted. There, standing in stark contrast to the serenity around him, was an ominous figure. The drive to maintain his impeccable fighting prowess was as sharp as the finely tuned muscles that rippled under his sleeve. Mike Tyson, blissfully unaware of the impending chaos, continued his tranquil stroll down the street. His thoughts drifted through the peaceful surroundings, the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees, the quiet hum of distant voices, the rhythm of his own steady breath. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pulse with a calm energy, a rhythm that matched his every step. The serene suburban evening, bathed in golden hues from the setting sun, embraced him, offering a brief respite from the intensity of his recent workout. The strain in his muscles, the pressure of his thoughts, began to fade into the background as he let the calmness wash over him. This was a man who had fought battles in the ring, real, life-and-death struggles. And yet now he walked without fear, without hesitation. But that tranquility was fleeting. The air, once gentle, now felt charged. A dark storm, looming just beyond the horizon of his awareness, was creeping closer. The disturbance in the air was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before the calm would be shattered. Something was out of place, a sinister force that would soon threaten the peaceful rhythm of Tyson's quiet world. As Mike drew closer to the next corner, an ominous sight emerged. Something was waiting for him. It wasn't the typical suburban tranquility he had come to know. No, this was something different. The tension was thick, and Mike's instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive in the ring, began to stir. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He couldn't place it, but he knew. Trouble was near. From the shadows, a police cruiser sat parked at the curb, its black and white exterior a stark contrast to the peaceful evening. The fading sunlight hit its glossy surface, casting long shadows across the street, turning the vehicle into an ominous presence in an otherwise calm neighborhood. The car's very existence seemed out of place, like a harbinger of something darker that was about to unfold. Leaning against the cruiser, arms crossed over his barrel-chested frame, stood Sergeant Reynolds. He was a towering figure in his 40s, his broad build and menacing presence making him an intimidating sight, even without him saying a word. His bristling mustache, thick and dark, only added to the harshness of his features, while his piercing eyes, cold and calculating, gazed out across the street, watching. To anyone who passed by, it was clear that Reynolds wasn't here to protect. He was here to assert control. His very posture, rigid and unyielding, screamed authority. But there was something more, a palpable air of menace that surrounded him. Reynolds wasn't just any cop. He was notorious for his excessive use of force, a reputation that stretched far beyond his small corner of the city. His methods were built on intimidation, fear, and a twisted sense of justice. His racial bias had earned him the disdain of many, but he didn't care. In his mind, he was the law, and the law in his hands was an instrument of power, one to be used for his own satisfaction. As Tyson continued his approach, a sinister glint flashed across Reynolds' eyes, his gaze locking onto the former boxer. The gleam was sharp, filled with contempt and a dangerous hunger for conflict. The tension between them, invisible but heavy, seemed to grow thicker by the second. Reynolds had already made his decision. He would make this confrontation a statement, a display of his power. And Mike Tyson, walking calmly into his world, had no idea what kind of storm was about to hit. Across Reynolds' eyes, a sharp glint flashed as they locked onto the approaching figure of Mike Tyson. In that moment, the peaceful neighborhood stroll that Tyson was taking seemed like a distant, almost laughable concept to Reynolds. The image of calm suburbia, with its cozy homes and quiet streets, was replaced by a growing sense of urgency, a desire to take advantage of the opportunity that had just presented itself. To Reynolds, Mike Tyson was not a man. He was a target, a tool, a chance to assert dominance and inflate his own fragile ego. Tyson, the celebrated boxer, was someone Reynolds saw not as a hero, but as a symbol of something he despised. The community may have loved Tyson, but Reynolds didn't care. He didn't see a beloved figure in the neighborhood. He saw only an object of opportunity. In that twisted mind of his, Tyson was a mere plaything, someone to be exploited, broken, and discarded. This wasn't about justice or the law. This was about a sadistic power trip. Every encounter with someone like Tyson was a chance to feed those dark desires, to put someone in their place, to remind them of who held the real power in the world. A sinister smirk curled at the corner of Reynolds' lips. It wasn't just a smile. It was the kind of grin that showed contempt, malice, and a chilling pleasure in the suffering of others. It was a twisted blend of arrogance and cruelty, one that seemed to grow with every step Tyson took closer to him. Reynolds' whole body tensed, as if he was savoring the moment before the storm, knowing that soon he would act. And when he did, it would be to show the world, and Tyson, who was truly in charge. Contempt and amusement twisted together in Reynolds' expression, his grip tightening around his holster as if to remind Tyson and himself of the authority he wielded. the cold metal of his gun pressed against his side, the very weight of it reinforcing his sense of control. He felt power surge through him, as though the simple act of touching his weapon could bend Tyson to his will. "Hey, you!" Reynolds bellowed, his voice cutting through the night like the bite of a blade. The words were sharp, harsh, and laced with a potent blend of arrogance and thinly veiled aggression. They echoed in the quiet evening, carrying the weight of an unsaid threat. It wasn't just a command. It was a declaration, a silent proclamation of dominance. His words barked out with military precision, every syllable sharp, every syllable calculated to assert control. There was no question about it. Reynolds intended to make this encounter one he would remember. He wanted to dominate, to humiliate, to remind Tyson that in his world there was no place for a man like him. But Mike Tyson stood his ground. His years of experience in the ring had instilled in him a deep well of patience and composure, qualities that served him far beyond the ropes. Where others might feel threatened or intimidated, Tyson's calmness only deepened. It was a quiet power, unspoken, but undeniable. His muscles were taut, his posture unyielding, but his mind was clear. This wasn't the first time he had been tested. It wouldn't be the last. Despite the aggression in Reynolds' voice, Tyson remained composed, his breath steady and his gaze unbroken. The years spent facing down opponents, some far more formidable than this officer, had given him a resilience that few could match. And in this moment, Tyson wasn't about to back down. The hurricane of emotions that were brewing beneath Mike Tyson's neutral facade was a storm only he could feel. But from the outside, he remained unshaken, his posture calm, his eyes unwavering. The chaos within him, the rush of adrenaline and instinct, was tempered by years of discipline. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and level, betraying nothing of the tempest beneath the surface. "Yes, officer," he responded, each syllable dripping with a casual defiance that masked the raging storm inside him. It was a voice that said he wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. His words were almost dismissive, as if the officer were just another opponent to face, not a man with a gun. Reynolds, however, was unfazed by Tyson's composure. If anything, it fueled his anger, twisting his perception even more. He moved closer, his every step calculated, deliberate. The metallic glint of his badge gleamed in the fading light, a not-so-subtle reminder of the power he wielded. It was the symbol of his authority, one he was determined to flaunt, to use as a weapon to remind Tyson of who controlled this interaction. With each step Reynolds took, the tension grew, his heavy boots scuffing the pavement with a rhythmic, almost predatory grace. He moved in closer, the sound of his footsteps heavy in the quiet of the street. There was no hurry in his approach, just the steady, unnerving presence of a man who thought he could dominate any situation, no matter how out of place his actions might be. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his voice low, edged with suspicion. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a challenge, one that hung in the air between them, thick and oppressive. The question came out not as a genuine inquiry, but as an accusation, heavy with disdain. Reynolds' eyes roamed over Mike's figure, scanning him with a sneer that seemed to strip him of his dignity. There was no subtlety in the officer's gaze, only a thinly veiled contempt. His eyes lingered, judging, as if Tyson, standing there in the middle of a peaceful neighborhood, was some sort of intruder, an anomaly that didn't belong. "You look out of place," Reynolds sneered, his words sharp and dripping with implication. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of suspicion, a mark of judgment that Tyson wasn't welcome here. The undertone was unmistakable, a thinly veiled accusation that suggested Tyson didn't have the right to be walking through this area. Reynolds made sure his words carried that power, as if the very act of standing there, in this neighborhood, was somehow a violation of some unwritten law. In the face of Reynolds' hostility, Mike's control remained absolute. He stood tall, unmoving, unshaken. His jaw tightened, but his posture never wavered. It was a silent protest, a resistance to the aggression being thrown at him. His calm demeanor, though, was his shield. It was unbroken, unwavering, a stark contrast to the storm of hostility Reynolds had unleashed. "I'm just taking a walk. That a problem?" Tyson responded, his voice even, devoid of any anger or fear. The challenge was subtle but firm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were a clear statement of his right to be there. The calmness in his voice, paired with his unflinching posture, made it clear. He wasn't intimidated, and he wasn't going anywhere. Tyson squared off against the looming menace of Reynolds, his body language a quiet defiance, an unspoken challenge. His presence in the street, seemingly ordinary, now stood as a bold statement. And Reynolds, despite the badge and the authority he thought he wielded, now had to face a man who wasn't afraid. The air between them seemed to crackle with a primal tension, a feral energy that pulsed between the two men, each refusing to back down. It was an invisible force, a thick, suffocating pressure that built with every second that passed, drawing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. The quiet around them seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the steady rhythm of Reynolds' boots against the pavement and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Reynolds, unable to contain the venom building within him, scoffed. The sound was contemptuous, derisive, cutting through the already fraught atmosphere like a knife through silk. His fingers drummed against the holster of his weapon with deliberate precision, each tap a rhythmic warning, as if he were the conductor of a violent symphony, preparing for the next chaotic movement. "People like you don't just take walks," he muttered, his voice laced with insinuation and malice. His words weren't a question. They were an accusation. A cruel insinuation that Tyson didn't belong, that his very presence here was somehow out of place, an intrusion that had to be questioned, controlled, subdued. Tyson stood firm, his eyes never leaving Reynolds, but the officer wasn't done. His voice dropped, cold and cutting, as if the threat was already implied, as if the tension had built to the point of no return. "You got ID on you?" he demanded. The words came out with a sneer, sharp and biting, as though Reynolds already knew the outcome of this encounter. As though he was merely waiting for Tyson to fall into the role that Reynolds had assigned to him, the role of the guilty, the one who was wrong, the one who had no right to be here. The implication was clear. Reynolds had already decided Tyson's fate, had already assigned him a place in this power struggle, and now, all that was left was for Tyson to comply. Reynolds had already written the script in his twisted mind, convinced of the outcome of this encounter. He was simply waiting for Mike to play his assigned role, to fall into the trap Reynolds had set, just like every other person who had ever dared cross him. But Mike Tyson was not like the others. Tyson's composure remained impregnable in the face of Reynolds' belligerence, a calmness that was unwavering and steady. He took a slow, measured breath, letting the air fill his lungs, grounding himself in the moment. There was no rush, no fear, only a quiet intensity building beneath the surface. His words came out deliberate, unwavering, each one cutting through the tension like a blade. "I don't need an ID to walk down the street." The calmness in his voice was not born of submission. No, it was a subtle warning, a challenge wrapped in serenity. It was a reminder to Reynolds, one that would be lost on most people, that Tyson's control was not to be mistaken for weakness. Beneath the tranquility, the storm of years of discipline, of pain and survival, was barely contained. Reynolds was dancing dangerously close to the edge of Mike's patience. Tyson's presence, despite the stillness, was electric. His calm demeanor masked the raw power of a man who had fought in the most brutal of arenas, a man who had faced physical and mental battles no one else could fathom. Reynolds' smirk, already contemptuous, twisted further, contorted into something darker, something that showed he was now fully committed to his dangerous path. Further fueling his disgust for Mike's defiance, Reynolds' contempt morphed into a twisted grimace of pure hatred. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he took another step forward. He was done playing games. "Don't play smart with me," Reynolds spat, his words sharp and dripping with vitriolic venom. Each syllable came out with a mixture of anger and revulsion, as if Tyson's mere existence in his town was an offense that could not be overlooked. "I know your type. Think you can do whatever you want, huh?" The sneer on Reynolds's face was one of pure disdain, as if Mike's refusal to cower had ignited something inside him, a need to remind this man of his place. "Well, not in my town," he added, his voice low, seething with control as he took another step forward, now almost directly in Mike's space. And with that, Reynolds moved. In a flash, his hand shot to his holster, the motion so fast, so precise, that it was like a well-rehearsed routine, the same one he had executed countless times before. His fingers gripped the gun with alarming speed, his wrist snapping the weapon free in one lightning-fast maneuver. The barrel of the gun was suddenly there, cold steel now poised against Mike's chest, a chilling reminder of the officer's power. The weapon's presence was as threatening as it was abrupt. The suddenness of it sent a wave of tension through the air, thickening the already charged atmosphere. For a brief moment, everything stood still. The only sound was the sharp click of the safety being released, echoing between them like the ominous sound of a ticking clock. Mike's eyes didn't flinch. His gaze remained unwavering, locked onto Reynolds as the cold barrel of the weapon pressed against him. The officer was trying to take control, to force Tyson into submission. But Tyson's calmness never wavered. The sudden action, coupled with the menacing presence of the firearm, sent a shock wave of adrenaline coursing through Mike Tyson's body. His reflexes, honed over years of training, kicked into overdrive. His muscles tensed, each fiber of his being preparing for the worst. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, the imminent danger palpable as his mind raced, calculating every possible move. As the scene unfolded, the few pedestrians within earshot gasped, their breaths caught in their throats. Their eyes went wide with a sudden, sharp fear, a collective jolt of shock and disbelief that hung thick in the air, almost like a toxic fog. It was as though the peaceful neighborhood they had all taken for granted had dissolved into a place of chaos, their sense of security shattered by the sudden appearance of a weapon. A nearby couple, engrossed in their own conversation on a park bench, froze in unison. They turned, their faces blanching with terror as they caught sight of the gun pointed directly at Mike's chest. The grotesque specter of the officer, standing with his weapon drawn, cast a dark shadow over everything, transforming what was once a quiet suburban evening into a nightmare unfolding before their very eyes. In that moment, the world seemed to stop. Time stretched as the barrel of the gun remained unwaveringly fixed on Tyson. The weight of the situation bore down on everyone nearby, their bodies tense with fear, uncertainty, and the anticipation of what would happen next. No one moved, no one breathed, except for the two men locked in this dangerous standoff. Tyson stood his ground, his posture as firm as ever, even as the eyes of the crowd around him widened with fear. But what the crowd didn't know, what Reynolds failed to recognize, was that Mike Tyson was no longer the man he once was. He was a fighter who had survived more than just physical battles. He had learned how to survive fear itself. Violence descended upon them like a shroud, a heavy, oppressive darkness that hung thick in the air. Despite the stark reality of Reynolds' gun pointed directly at his chest, Mike Tyson remained unbowed. His stance, firm and resolute, was the very embodiment of defiance, the warrior spirit within him, forged over years of struggle and survival, refused to yield. An unflappable defiance was etched into his steely gaze, one that didn't waver in the face of imminent danger. His eyes were locked on the barrel of the weapon, and the depth of his resolve was clear. On the surface, he was an immovable wall, his body as solid as granite, unbroken by the aggression that pressed against him. His expression was a mask of stoic resilience, a silent rebuff against the arrogant authority of his aggressor. Reynolds may have thought he had the upper hand, but Tyson knew this was different. This wasn't a controlled environment, a place where rules and regulations held sway. This wasn't the ring, where victory and defeat were defined by time and rules. Here, there were no refs' whistles or countouts. This was raw, real, and Tyson understood that better than anyone. As Reynolds stood there, gun in hand, thinking his weapon would break Mike's spirit, Tyson's unspoken message was loud and clear. He was no ordinary man to be intimidated. The grim realization of what was unfolding dawned on Mike with the certainty of an impending storm. This wasn't a ring. This wasn't a controlled environment where rules and regulations dictated the flow of the battle. This was real life, raw, unfiltered, where the stakes were higher than any championship belt. The consequences here would be more devastating than a knockout blow. And Mike, for all his experience, knew that the situation before him was one where even the smallest misstep could cost him everything. Reynolds, however, was blinded by his arrogance. Feeding off the rush of power that came with holding a weapon, the cold steel of it pressed firmly against Mike's chest, he became intoxicated by the control he thought he had over the situation. The officer's hubris knew no bounds. His voice was thick with condescension, laced with a dictator's arrogance, as he barked his command, "Get on your knees." The words were harsh, dripping with an ugly brand of superiority, as if Mike's dignity could be stripped away with a mere order. Reynolds believed that his badge, his gun, his power were all the tools he needed to bend Tyson to his will. He had no idea that Tyson was more than just a man. He was a force of nature, something far beyond the scope of Reynolds's narrow vision. The word hung in the air now, punctuating his demand like the crack of a whip, sharp and final. The scene unfolded in slow motion, each passing second dragging the tension deeper as the full weight of Reynolds' command settled over them. The implications of such an act of submission were undeniable. Mike Tyson was being forced into a position of weakness, and everyone around them could feel the oppressive weight of it. The tension in the air grew thick, winding tighter and tighter, ratcheting up to a near breaking point. Mike's expression remained as steady as a rock, his gaze unwavering and calm, in stark contrast to the simmering fury boiling inside Reynolds. His anger was palpable, a barely contained storm that was ready to erupt, but Tyson's stillness was a jarring reminder of just how little control Reynolds had. The spiraling tension between the two men crackled like an electric current, an unseen force surging between them. Every breath, every heartbeat felt like it was preparing for something monumental, something that would change the course of this standoff. And then, like a spark igniting a powder keg, Tyson smirked. The subtle curl of his lips was the first sign of a quiet defiance, one that belied the stillness of his body. It was as if he had been waiting for this very moment. His composure wasn't a sign of submission, it was a warning. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Mike's voice was calm, yet filled with an edge, as if he were speaking not just to Reynolds, but to the very notion of power that the officer represented. The challenge hung in the air, a promise that this situation was far from over. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Mike asked, his voice dripping with the razor-sharp venom of an apex predator. The words were calm, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a declaration. Reynolds could feel the power in Tyson's presence, an energy that he couldn't ignore. Tyson's stillness wasn't submission. It was control, something Reynolds could never understand, and it rattled him to his core. At first, Reynolds' hand trembled imperceptibly, like the faint ripples of a stone thrown into a pond. The tremor was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there, a sign that his arrogance, his false sense of invincibility, was starting to crack. For a moment, the powerful officer, who had built his career on fear, felt something far more vulnerable: fear itself. But his ego, that toxic belief in his own power, forced him to suppress it. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not in front of Tyson. "I said," Reynolds repeated, his voice strained, the words scraping through his clenched teeth. The veneer of authority he had worn so proudly began to crack under the weight of Tyson's unyielding defiance. The calm, calculated resolve in Mike's stance shattered the illusion of control Reynolds had relied on, and it pushed him to the edge. And then, in a burst of blinding speed that defied human reflexes, Mike moved. His hand shot out with the precision of a cobra strike, faster than Reynolds could even comprehend. Before the officer could react, Tyson slapped the gun away with an explosive force, sending the weapon clattering to the pavement. The shock of the motion, the speed with which it happened, left Reynolds standing in stunned disbelief, his body still frozen in place as the sound of the gun hitting the ground reverberated in the tense air. With a deafening swack that echoed in the air, the weapon was wrenched from Reynolds's grasp and clattered to the pavement. The sharp sound of metal hitting concrete reverberated in the night, mirroring the sharp jolt of pain that shot up the officer's arm. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, a reminder that he was no longer in control of this situation. The gun, once a symbol of authority, now lay useless on the ground. The speed at which Reynolds, once the epitome of unbridled aggression, crumpled beneath Mike Tyson's wrath was breathtaking. In a single, fluid motion, Tyson had shifted the balance of power, and Reynolds, who had thought himself untouchable, was now a puppet whose strings had been violently severed. His body recoiled, stumbling backward, trying to regain his footing, but it was too late. His movement was sluggish, uncoordinated, like a man who had been struck with an overwhelming force. Tyson didn't hesitate. As the officer staggered, trying to find his balance, Mike's lightning-fast left hook connected with Reynolds's ribs, a devastating blow that sent shockwaves through the officer's body. A choked gasp tore from Reynolds's throat, the sound of his pain hanging in the air like an echo. The force of the punch had driven the wind from his lungs, leaving him gasping for breath as his body curled around the point of impact. Reynolds's once towering form had now been reduced to a crumpled mess, barely able to stay upright, his body betraying him as Tyson's power and precision took their toll. The officer's vision blurred, his senses assaulted by the pain, and his mind raced to process what had just happened. How quickly he had gone from being the one in control to being completely at Tyson's mercy. A guttural gasp, torn from the depths of Reynolds' lungs, echoed in the stillness of the night, the sound sharp and desperate as he doubled over in agony. His eyes were wide, filled with shock and pain, a stark contrast to the arrogant confidence he had shown moments before. The breathless cry reverberated in the air, hanging for a split second before fading into the tense silence that followed. Like a demolition expert brought in to reduce an entire building to rubble, Mike Tyson continued his unrelenting assault. Every punch, every strike was deliberate and precise, tearing down Reynolds's defenses one by one. The officer, who had once thought himself in control, had now become a mere puppet, completely at the mercy of Tyson's fists. There was no room for escape, no way for Reynolds to regain his footing. He was nothing more than a target in this brutal display of power. Tyson's uppercut came next, a powerful blow, driven by a mix of calculated precision and volcanic fury. The punch landed squarely on Reynolds' jaw, and in that instant, time seemed to freeze. The force of the blow launched Reynolds off his feet, sending him careening through the air like a rag doll, completely weightless, as if his body no longer had control. He collided with the ground with a sickening thud, the sound of his body slamming into the pavement reverberating like a final, irreversible collapse. The night air was thick with the aftermath of the violent exchange. Reynolds lay there, crumpled and motionless, the fight completely drained from him. The man who had once threatened Tyson now lay broken, his pride shattered along with his body. In a matter of moments, the once frozen crowd, their eyes transfixed on the brutal display unfolding before them, began to stir to life. The silence that had gripped them, thick and heavy, was slowly broken by the sound of murmurs. At first, it was a low, fearful hum, the kind of sound made by people unsure of what to make of the violent spectacle they were witnessing. But as the scene played out, as Mike Tyson continued to rain down his retribution on Reynolds with an unforgiving fury, that hum transformed. It grew louder, more urgent, and soon became a buzz of incredulity. The crowd began to grasp the sheer magnitude of what was happening. What had started as a routine interaction between an officer and a civilian had exploded into something far more profound. A man, once seen as untouchable, was now being broken before their eyes. The officer, Reynolds, who had instilled fear in them, who had wielded his badge like a weapon, was now the one crumpled on the ground, helpless. As Tyson continued to deliver blow after blow, the crowd's emotions began to shift. A slow, collective nod of satisfaction rippled through them. They didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The message was clear in their expressions, in the quiet approval that seemed to spread among them like a wave. They had watched Reynolds terrorize others, knowing that justice was often out of reach for people like him. But now, watching him receive his just deserts, they felt the tide of their emotions turn. This was not just about a fight. This was about a man who had abused his power for far too long, finally facing the consequences. It was a moment that resonated with them, deep in their bones, as they witnessed the fall of their once dreaded tormentor. Reynolds, his face a mix of pain and bewilderment, coughed and sputtered, grasping at straws as he tried to salvage the situation. His body trembled, his breath ragged and shallow as he fought to lift himself from the ground. You're assaulting an officer," he wheezed, his voice barely above a whisper. His words came out slow, strained, as he struggled to push himself onto his side. The absurdity of his accusation hung in the air like a bad smell, rancid and hollow, a pitiful attempt to reassert control over a situation where he had none. His feeble protestations were as weak as his physical state, a pale shadow of the arrogance he had carried just moments before. He was broken, not just in body, but in spirit. His words were nothing more than the last vestige of his inflated authority, a desperate grasp at relevance in a moment where he no longer held any power. Mike Tyson, standing above him, cast an ominous shadow over Reynolds' crumpled form. He loomed over the officer like an avenging angel, his figure towering, his body tense, fists clenched and poised. Every muscle in his body was a testament to the control he had fought so hard to master, and now, with Reynolds defeated, it was clear that the power had shifted. There would be no mercy, no further struggle for dominance. Tyson's presence was enough to show Reynolds the price of his abuse of power. The officer's feeble protests were drowned out by the weight of the moment. Tyson was no longer just a man defending himself. He was an instrument of justice, a force of nature that had put an end to the reign of a tyrant. And Reynolds, now completely at his mercy, could do nothing but lie there, the humiliation setting in. Mike's expression hardened, his features set like granite, a mask of unwavering resolve. The rage that simmered beneath the surface was evident, but he controlled it with the precision of a fighter who knew when to strike and when to wait. "You assaulted yourself the second you pulled that gun on me," Mike growled, his voice gravelly, thick with barely contained fury. The words came out slow, deliberate, but the weight behind them was crushing. His words cut through the air like the swing of a guillotine blade, swift, final, and without mercy. Reynolds, still dazed and broken, tried desperately to reclaim some semblance of power, to shift the balance back in his favor. In a futile effort, he scrambled toward his fallen weapon, his body limp and heavy, struggling to move against the pain that shot through him with each movement. His fingers clawed at the pavement, his effort a pitiful display of the pride that had been shattered by Tyson's unrelenting assault. But before he could grasp the weapon, before he could even hope to reclaim the smallest shred of control, Mike moved. His movement was swift and precise, his foot planting firmly on Reynolds' wrist, pinning it to the ground with the kind of force that left no room for resistance. Reynolds' body twisted in pain, his attempt to escape the grip of fate futile as Mike's weight and strength held him in place. The once proud officer, who had felt untouchable just moments ago, was now entirely at Mike's mercy. The realization was like a cold slap to the face. He had no control, no power left to wield. His arm was immobilized, his body broken, and the gun, once the symbol of his authority, now lay useless at his side. Mike's foot pressed down harder, the pressure pinning Reynolds' wrist to the ground with an intensity that made the officer wince and gasp. Each breath was labored, each movement a struggle as the pain shot through his arm, his pride crumbling beneath the weight of Mike's dominance. With this single act, Tyson made it abundantly clear. This time, It was he who had the upper hand. There was no question now. Reynolds was powerless, completely at Mike's mercy. Reynolds's voice, hoarse and tremulous, rose above the low murmurs of the crowd. His words were weak, pathetic, a pitiful plea that seemed to echo through the stillness of the night, carried by the cool evening air. "Please, He choked on the words, his throat constricting as if the bitterness of his defeat had lodged itself there, refusing to let him speak clearly. The words were fragmented, barely audible, but their meaning was clear. The arrogance that had once flowed so freely from him had been replaced with desperation. The full weight of his mistake seemed to bear down on him in that moment. Everything he had built, the fear he had instilled in others, the power he had wielded with such ruthless confidence, all of it had been shattered. And now, as he lay broken before Tyson, his pleas seemed hollow, a pale echo of the arrogance he had once wielded so easily. They carried no weight, no authority, just the faint traces of a man who had fallen from a great height. Mike, standing over him, his fists still clenched, didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence, his calm dominance, was enough. The message had already been delivered. Mike's voice, a sonic boom of menace, boomed through the alley like a thunderclap, the words reverberating in Reynolds's skull like a warning shot. The raw power of the statement echoed, each syllable a heavy reminder of the reality that Reynolds could no longer deny. "You like using your badge to push people around? Think you're untouchable?" The force of Tyson's words hit Reynolds with the same impact as the blows he had endured, and in that moment, Reynolds's arrogance seemed to evaporate. Tyson's face was mere inches from Reynolds's contorted grimace, the intense proximity amplifying the brutality of the encounter. Every inch between them felt like a universe of power, a reminder of how far Reynolds had fallen from the pedestal he had once perched on. A subtle shiver ran through the crowd, a collective moment of realization. They had witnessed a shift, a monumental change in the power dynamic that had dominated their lives. The man who had once been their tormentor, the officer who had ruled through fear and intimidation, was now nothing more than a broken shell at the mercy of the very people he had terrorized. The realization was like a ripple through the crowd, the energy of the moment settling over them as they saw the truth. Reynolds was no longer the one in control. Reynolds' swagger, once so pronounced, vanished in an instant. The bravado he had carried with him like armor was obliterated, reduced to nothing more than a feeble shell of the man he had once been. He shook his head, a futile attempt to reclaim some semblance of his former self, but there was no strength in the gesture. His pride, his sense of superiority, had been shattered in a matter of moments. He was no longer the predator. He was the prey. Reynolds shook his head with frenzied desperation, the hollow denial of a man who had underestimated his prey and paid a heavy price for his arrogance. His lips trembled, forming silent pleas for mercy, but no words came. The pride that had once defined him now crumbled into nothingness, leaving only the raw, terrifying realization of his vulnerability. His eyes, wide with panic, locked onto the figure towering above him, Mike Tyson, the figure who, in that moment, seemed to radiate a seething wrath like a furnace, burning hot with the intensity of a storm that had reached its peak. For the first time in his life, Reynolds understood what it was like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of another's rage. His entire existence had been built on domination, on wielding fear like a weapon, but now, here he was, broken, weak, and utterly at Tyson's mercy. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, a bitter pill of helplessness he couldn't swallow, and for the first time in his life, he was terrified. Mike Tyson, however, showed no sign of giving in to his own fury. His rage, once overwhelming, began to abate like the ebb of a violent storm, the intensity of it receding, but still lingering. Tyson stood over Reynolds, his breath heavy and labored, but his stance remained calm, unyielding, as if he had already found peace in the moment. There was no need for further violence, no need for more words. The message had been delivered. In this stillness, Tyson's calmness contrasted sharply with Reynolds's panic. It was clear that the battle had been won, not through brute force, but through unwavering strength of character, something Reynolds could never comprehend. Tyson's control was absolute, his power now untouchable. Mike stood tall, his breath heavy, as if he had just completed another grueling round in the ring. The lesson had been delivered, hard and fast, like a punch to the gut. With every gasping breath Reynolds took, he could feel the weight of his own hubris crushing him, the bitter realization that he had pushed too far, that his actions had consequences he could no longer escape. The echoes of his pain reverberated through him, a reminder that his arrogance had led him here, to this moment of utter defeat. Mike, satisfied that he had taught Reynolds a lesson that words could never teach, straightened up. There was no need for more violence, no need for more confrontation. The lesson had been learned, not in words, but in action. Without another word, Tyson turned away from his fallen adversary, his movements deliberate and calm. He had done what he needed to do. He had exposed the weakness behind the mask of power, and now it was time to walk away. Reynolds, broken and humiliated, his body protesting with each agonizing step, staggered towards his car. Every movement was a struggle, his legs shaky and unsteady, like a man condemned to walk through the fires of his own creation. The weight of his defeat was more than just physical. It was a soul-crushing realization that he had lost everything: his authority, his pride, and his sense of control. With each staggered step, the officer seemed smaller, diminished by his own failure, until he reached his car, the final symbol of his futile attempt to assert dominance. Reynolds fled the scene, his feet pounding the pavement with frantic desperation, like a man desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and his tormentor. His every step was driven by the fear that now consumed him, the weight of his defeat pressing down on him like a physical force. He had been humbled, broken, and all he wanted was to escape, to retreat back into the shell of the life he had once known, even if it meant running from the consequences of his own actions. As he stumbled into his patrol car, his movements were disjointed, erratic, as though his body itself could not catch up with the sheer panic that coursed through him. He didn't spare a second glance at the weapon he'd so callously brandished just moments earlier. The gun, which had symbolized his authority and power, now lay abandoned on the pavement, a useless relic of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. But Reynolds didn't care. He was beyond thinking about the weapon. It no longer mattered. With a furious twist of the handle, Reynolds flung open the car door, his desperation palpable. Every action was quick, jagged, filled with the urgency of a man who had just come face to face with his own vulnerability. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the seatbelt, his mind racing, but his body moving as though on autopilot. There was no glory in his retreat, only the crushing realization that his pride had been shattered, and the person who had brought him to this point was walking away without a second thought. Reynolds threw himself into the driver's seat, his body contorting into a cramped and ungainly position, like a soldier retreating from a lost battle. The fear and desperation that had taken over him were visible in every movement, as if he were physically trying to escape not just the scene, but the reality of his own collapse. His hands shook as he slammed the door shut, his breath ragged with the weight of his defeat. Without hesitation, he gunned the engine, the sound of the tires squealing in protest as they spun on the pavement, fighting for traction. The car shot forward, moving with frantic speed, as Reynolds sped away, desperate to outrun the demons of his own creation, the consequences of his actions that now chased him down with every heartbeat. The roar of the engine was like the final desperate attempt of a man trying to outrun everything he had done wrong. In his wake, the street stood silent once more, as if the entire neighborhood held its breath, processing the events they had just witnessed. The air was thick with tension, the collective sense of disbelief hanging over everyone like a fog. The sounds of the world seemed muted, as if the encounter between Reynolds and Tyson had momentarily frozen time itself. The silence that hung over the street after Reynolds' hasty departure was broken by the quiet yet unmistakable sound of admiration. A low whistle, soft at first, almost hesitant, before it grew in volume, joined by others, rippling through the crowd. It wasn't the loud cheer of victory, but the quiet acknowledgement of justice served, of seeing the once mighty fall and realizing that, in the end, righteousness had prevailed. The murmurs of respect filled the air, not for the violence, but for the lesson delivered. The whistle began low at first, hesitant, unsure, but soon it gained in volume, spreading through the crowd as more people joined in the chorus of appreciation. It was quiet at first, a subtle acknowledgement, but as the sound spread, it grew louder, stronger. Soon, the air filled with the rhythmic sound of clapping, spontaneous and genuine, a collective recognition of the man who had stood up to tyranny and emerged victorious. This wasn't just a moment of retribution. It was a celebration of justice, of resilience in the face of corruption. The applause swelled, echoing through the street, an impromptu ovation for someone who had dared to do what others couldn't or wouldn't. It wasn't about the violence, but about standing firm when it mattered most, about showing that no matter the odds, one man could make a difference. In that moment, Mike Tyson was no longer just a former boxer, no longer just a man taking a leisurely stroll through the neighborhood. He had become something more, a symbol of hope, of strength, of courage against all odds. The very qualities that had made him a champion in the ring now defined him outside of it. His quiet demeanor in the face of the chaos he had just created only amplified his newfound status. As the applause echoed in his wake, Mike Tyson, his face set in a mask of cool nonchalance, simply dusted off his hands, as though brushing away the remnants of a task he had already accomplished. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for words. His actions had spoken louder than anything he could have said. With a final glance at the crowd, he turned and continued walking down the street, his stride steady, unhurried, as if this was just another day. But for everyone who had witnessed the events unfold, this day would remain etched in their memories forever. The gesture was subtle, yet powerful, a silent declaration of a job well done. Tyson simply dusted off his hands, his actions speaking louder than any words could. He turned his back on the chaos he had left behind, the destruction of Reynolds's arrogance, and the swift justice served. With no further need for acknowledgement, he continued his stroll down the street, each step a measured beat in the rhythm of a man who had faced down his demons and walked away triumphant. There was no show of emotion, no desire for recognition. He didn't smile, nor did he bask in the glory of the moment. But while Mike walked away, the people who had witnessed the confrontation stood frozen, still processing what they had just seen. The echoes of applause lingered in the air, fading, but the reverberations of the events of that evening would remain in their hearts forever. The story of how one man stood up to tyranny and showed that power could be seized from the hands of the corrupt would be recounted time and time again. It was a story that would be passed down through the ages, told to children and grandchildren, becoming a part of local folklore, a tale of courage, of defiance, and of justice served. In that moment, Mike Tyson was not just a man. He had become a legend, an enduring symbol of hope and strength. His actions had marked a turning point not just for himself, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The streets had been quieted, the night had fallen, but the legacy of what had transpired would echo forever. Like a treasured piece of folklore, the tale of the man who stood up to tyranny, who refused to back down in the face of injustice, would live on. It would be recounted through generations, told in hushed tones and loud exclamations alike, growing in legend with each retelling. The story would be shared in whispers of admiration, the kind of tale that inspires others to stand tall in the face of adversity. The moral of the story, like a punchline delivered with perfect timing, was simple, yet profound. True power didn't reside in a badge, a gun, or the fear it inspired. Those things were fragile, fleeting. Power was an intangible quality, one that could not be seen, but could be felt. It resided in the hearts of the brave, in their unwavering resolve to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. It was the quiet strength to pick battles wisely, to know when to strike and when to turn their backs on the unworthy. Mike Tyson had understood that better than anyone. His true power lay not in his fists, nor in his past as a champion in the ring, but in his ability to act with integrity when faced with a moment of moral reckoning. He had shown that the true measure of a man's strength wasn't in his ability to dominate, but in his courage to stand for justice when it mattered most. As his legacy grew, so too did the lesson he had taught. That real power comes from within, from the strength to do what's right, regardless of the odds. Tyson's victory wasn't just physical, it was a triumph of the spirit, an indelible mark left on the world, reminding everyone who heard the story that justice, courage, and the human will could always triumph over corruption and cruelty. Tyson didn't just fight back against Reynolds' injustice, he exposed the man for what he truly was, a coward. It wasn't just the physical confrontation that had defeated Reynolds. It was the exposure of his weaknesses, his fear, and his corruption. Tyson had shown the world that the man who had once wielded his badge like a weapon of control was nothing more than a man afraid of facing the consequences of his own actions. As Reynolds lay broken, the weight of his failure was clear. No longer could he hide behind the mask of authority or his weapon. Tyson had stripped him of his power, not just through force, but by revealing the true nature of his character. It was a revelation that would linger long after the dust settled. Tyson didn't need to say a word. His actions had done all the talking. In a single moment, he had stripped Reynolds of the fear he had so carefully cultivated in others and replaced it with something much more powerful: the truth. And the truth had a power that no badge, no weapon, could ever protect Reynolds from. Reynolds had been exposed, not as a man of strength, but as a coward, hiding behind his badge and his gun, too afraid to face the reality of his own corruption. Tyson had not just defeated him physically, he had shattered the illusion of invincibility that Reynolds had built for himself.